I've read 3 of the Women's Prize books so far, and I've enjoyed them all. These are 3 very different books, and I'm just choosing them at random. I don't have a specific order that I'm reading any of these books in. I'm anticipating some of these books a little bit more than others, and so I might pick them up a little bit quicker, but I'm also trying to spread them out. So I'm gonna just give you my general impressions, the things that I thought were strengths of each book, potential like slight things that I just would have preferred to be a little bit different, or that I just didn't, really get along with well. And hopefully if you are interested in any of these books, that will help you decide if you want to read them or not. If you're new to my channel, I tend to read a lot of literary fiction and fantasy. Today is definitely gonna lean into the more literary fiction books, but those are my 2 main genres. I try to read pretty widely, so I also read a lot of like horror and romance, occasional nonfiction books. So you'll see that reflected in the different books that I haul and that I talk about, and if that sounds interesting to you, then I hope that you stick around. So the first book that I read was Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes, and as you can tell from the cover, this is Medusa's story. I read Natalie Haynes's previous book that was on this list, 1,000 Ships, and I really adored that book a lot. Really well written, and even though we spent a very small amount of time with each of those characters in 1,000 Ships, I felt like I really was connected to them. I was interested to see what would be different when we got focused in on one character, as we were supposed to have done here. I guess the first thing that you will notice if you decide to read this book is that it does not just focus on Medusa. I mean, clearly there are other characters, god beings, and humans who are gonna play a role in her story, but we frequently leave Medusa to go see what other characters are up to. So we hear this story through a lot of different perspectives, and some of those perspectives are more centrally related to Medusa and her life and what happens to her. Some of those characters or perspectives, I guess, are much more like tangentially related. And so, for example, there was one chapter that it was, I believe, like a crow, some kind of bird. I can't remember what kind exactly, but it was a bird who happened to be sort of flying by and seeing part of the plot unravel. And so we do hear about her story from many different lenses, like from many different perspectives. We do hear from Medusa herself as well. I'm gonna whack myself in the face with this. I think the second thing that I did not really expect in this book was the humor. I did not remember 1,000 Ships being humorous, but this book made me laugh out loud many times. I was taking pictures and sending it to the group chat, especially when you got to the gods like Athena and Hermes, and then their shenanigans with Perseus. I really enjoyed the way that Natalie Haynes differentiated between humans and gods. The gods sort of took things for granted, didn't understand, like how to raise a baby or like how time passes. That was a big difference between how we would maybe read a typical story and how they were experiencing it. So I really appreciated that difference, but then it also, of course, led to a lot of humor and misunderstandings between the gods and then other people who are not as immortal as them. I did feel a little bit detached from the story, just a contrast with another similar book that has sort of a similar premise. The book Circe by Madeline Miller. I liked her approach to Circe a lot better than I like this approach to Medusa, because we were so frequently like leaving Medusa's perspective and seeing what other characters or what other gods were doing, and all of those things like would ultimately have an impact on Medusa. But the way that Madeline Miller did Circe, you were always with her and always understanding her perspective. And I think it's kind of ironic really, because the same year that 1,000 Ships was on the long list, Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker was also on the list, and I ended up really disliking the Silence of the Girls because it didn't give me what it said in the blurb, which was to focus on the women, Troy, like the Trojan War. Yeah, I think it was the women during the Trojan War. That was supposed to be the central like conceit of the Silence of the Girls, but it ended up really not being in my mind. Felt a little bit like that here with Medusa, where Medusa is supposed to be at the center of the story, and then she ultimately didn't feel like she was at the center of the story for me. But to come back around to why I brought up Cersei, that story I think is an example of really centering a specific character and telling their story from their perspective. And it's not just a matter of like having the plot narration just stay in one place, but also focusing on one character's feelings and experiences and thought. And so I would have liked that. The thing is, I'm giving all this criticism, but I really liked this book. I had a good time. It was pretty easy to read and it was enjoyable. Like I said, I laughed a lot. So I did really enjoy this book and I would recommend it. I think just with those couple of caveats, to be aware that you're not 100% just focused on Medusa, that there is a lot of wandering about the narrative to other characters. I think if that's fine with you, then I would definitely give this a try. The next book that I read was Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow, and this book follows the North family, and they live in Tennessee, Memphis, obviously. It follows through 3 generations in particular. The first generation is Hazel and Myron. We know some of this. I'm not gonna spoil anything. Some of this we already know. Myron builds this home for Hazel, and he ends up getting lynched relatively young. Then we follow their daughters, who are Miriam and August, and then the next generation is Joan, Maya, and Derek. I was right, it's Derek. So Joan, Maya, and Derek are the kids of August and Miriam, the sisters. The book starts with Miriam, who is leaving her abusive husband, and so she takes Joan and Maya to go live with her sister, August. I would say of all the characters, we most closely follow Joan, who's the eldest sister in the youngest generation. When they go back home and go to move back in with August, this traumatic memory resurfaces with Joan and sort of sets off this chain of remembrance and kind of going back and forth through all these different generations and exploring like how these different couples met and then how they drifted apart, or you know, the sort of abuse or trauma that they each endured. I think of these 3 books, this was probably my favorite because it was so beautifully written, like describing the place that a particular scene was in. She had this really beautiful language that made you like feel like you were there. But more than that, I really appreciated the fact that start with this very strong emotion towards certain characters because of what they have done to each other or what they have endured, and then this book is constantly unraveling that. So you feel like Miriam is 100% justified in leaving her husband, and then, for example, you learn something that he has gone through. Now, I do want to say that none of this is in order to excuse their behavior or the way that they have treated one another. It's more that you learn something about each of these characters, and you know, things are slowly revealed that help you to understand the characters more. So it's not that these things that they've done to each other are forgiven or excused or explained away or anything. It's just that you get a much more complete picture of who these characters are as people and the ways that they have responded to the events that they have been thrust into sometimes, you know, really without control in some cases. Like, as I was going through this book and reading, this image of like an onion came to mind, like peeling back the layers of an onion. It's still an onion. You know, nothing about that this story is changing necessarily when you hear what has happened to one character or another. You do get a deeper and better appreciation for who they are. And at the end, I think forgiveness is a big theme or a big factor in this book. It would be really interesting to go back and read this book again, knowing everything that I know about the characters, sort of revisiting how she created these situations that seem very black and white, very easy to interpret as either, as you know, one character being the good guy and one character being the bad guy. But then when you actually get the full complete picture, you realize that, like, yes, that was a really horrible thing that, you know, person A did to person B, but person A is also dealing with their own crap. Like I said, I think of the 3 so far, this one is my favorite. The The third book that I have read is I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel, and you can tell I've like tabbed a couple of pages here. Good when I do that typically, because it means that I wanted to remember something, but ultimately I'm so conflicted about this book. The general synopsis of this book is that you're following an unnamed narrator who is obsessed with a couple of people. So there is a man who she wants to be with. They see each other like secretly, but they don't have sex very often because he has put that boundary on her. So she's obsessed with this man because she wants to be with him romantically, but then she's more obsessed with a woman who he used to be with before, and he has this sort of on again off again relationship. You can probably tell just from that synopsis that this is one of those books where everyone in this situation is the asshole, but there's a whole lot more going on in this book. So our main character, who is cyber stalking this woman that she has never even met, is making a lot of commentary. She's like constantly refreshing this woman's Instagram page and like just checking her. She's a pretty well known person, a pretty famous person, and so there's a lot of ways for the narrator to just continually check up on this woman and be apprised of her life and like what's going on. So there is a lot of commentary on like a lot of things. So identity is a huge one. There are a lot of questions about the creation of identity online and like the performance of our identities online. There are also discussions of objects, like objects as beautiful things, objects as conveying or conferring some sort of status on their owner. Also, the idea of like performative allyship comes in here a lot. And then there are just these issues of like loneliness. Like the narrator is so frustrating. She's so freaking frustrating. She has a boyfriend who seems, I mean, for all intents and purposes, seems to be a pretty good person and seems to really care about her, but she's just obsessed with basically what is the unobtainable. Not even an aspirational lifestyle. I think that in her weak moments, she does admit to herself that if she could trade places with the woman that she's obsessed with, she probably would, even as she is simultaneously writing these really scathing observations about the fact that, you know, this woman will include women of color as models for her business, but then not actually carry any products created by people of color. So there's a lot of really insightful, like I said, scathing observations in this book. However, my big issue with it was that I feel like for all of the questions that it had about identity and performance of such online, I felt like this book suffered from a bit of an identity crisis itself, because there were sections that just felt so insightful and also felt like they should have been, you know, the subject of an essay, but not the subject of a book in the way that they were presented. Like, I definitely think you can ask these questions and make these observations in a fiction book, but the way that they were framed did not feel like that. It felt incongruent with the larger plot, and honestly with who the main character really was, which maybe that's the point. Maybe I have hit on the point and I've decided I don't like it. I don't know. Like I said, I just have such conflicting feelings about this, because there were parts also, I have to say, that I laughed out loud when I was reading this. Some of the chapter headings were really funny, like one about taking screenshots. I might look innocent, but I screenshot a lot. I thought that was yeah, I do that. There was also actually some commentary on the idea of minimalism and like aesthetic minimalism, or minimalism as a lifestyle. One of the quotes that I had here was about that. She said, they want you to buy their goods, but their material diet is one of abstinence. There are just some quotes in here that just really like punched me in the face, I felt like, emotionally. So the other one that I marked, this one's a little bit longer. She said, do I weaponize my own pain and cause harm to myself by reveling in that pain, nurturing it, putting myself in danger to encourage it, and then working it over by verbalizing it for display to show society I am a human being and I feel pain just like you? Is this violence turned inward, a knife in my hand, the weight of my body grifting down to the hilt? So in that particular section, she's talking about being a woman of color and having to basically utilize her pain and her suffering or her trauma in order to get people to recognize her as a human being. Intellectually, there was a lot lot here, and it was really fascinating, and clearly I have a lot of thoughts about it. It just felt like it didn't quite fit. I suppose it's just a little difficult to sort of get a hold of all of these observations and feel like there is cohesion when at the center of this book is a narrator who is constantly effacing her own identity. She's constantly, from one chapter to the next, she'll use capital I and then she'll use lowercase I. Her tone will change. She'll seem like to view her life in one way in one chapter, and then in the next, she's just completely disregarding, you know, everything around her. And it's so, I guess it's sort of hard to get a hold of who the narrator is in this book, and I feel like that is part of the point. It just, I guess, felt a little incongruous to me. It felt like there were parts of this that were very fiction, and then parts of this that were maybe more suited for nonfiction. And like I said, it was more in the way that it was presented rather than the fact that, like, I obviously think a lot of these questions can be grappled with in fiction. It's just the way that they were framed felt more like nonfiction to me. Well, my memory card decided to be full, so let's try this again. I am in the middle of reading Demon Copperhead. That's a little generous, actually. I'm only about like 70 pages in right now, I believe. So I'll definitely be finishing that in the next week or so. I am gonna try to do another review next weekend that has 3 more books on it, but given how long Demon Copperhead is, I don't know, we'll see. I might have to just make that its own like dedicated thing in order to keep up my once a week pace. But if you've read on any of these 3 books, or if my thoughts about them have put you on them or off of them, or if you have any thoughts about what I have said about them, then let me know, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.